Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Purchasing Division's Agency-Delegated Purchasing online module. In order to gain credit for this course, you will need to print off a copy of the Certificate of Completion and have it signed by your immediate supervisor or agency head. Email or fax a copy of the completed certificate to the Staff Development Specialist of the Purchasing Division. You'll find that contact information on the last slide of this presentation. Let's get started. In this presentation, I'll explain the bid requirements for the different spending limits within the agency's delegated authority. I'll identify the steps required to make an agency-delegated purchase, beginning with acquisition planning. And finally, I'll discuss the forms that are required, when applicable, to complete agency-delegated purchases. When making an agency-delegated purchase, the agency must consider the annual spending limit that the purchase will fall under, and follow the appropriate bid process for that amount. Commodities and services that are expected to cost $2,500 or less require no bids. However, competition is always encouraged and will help increase your chances of getting the best value for your dollars. For purchases $2,500.01 to $5,000, 3 verbal bids are required where possible. After the evaluation of all bids by the agency personnel, an award is made to the lowest responsible bidder meeting the specifications. Generally defined, a responsible bidder is able to furnish the required needs of the organization as requested in the specifications. All bids should be documented using the Verbal Bid Quotation Summary Form, also known as a Wv4 Daa, and be placed in the agency file. If an award is made to someone other than the lowest bidder, a written justification detailing why the lowest bidder was not considered responsible must be retained for public record and inspection. The justification must be signed by the evaluators and retained as part of the bid file. Purchases $5,000.01 to $25,000 require 3 written bids where possible, and again, the lowest bid meeting specifications must be awarded the purchase order or contract. Keep in mind that awards are to be made only to vendors who are properly registered with the Purchasing Division. Agencies should use a Request for Quotations form, known as a Wv43, to document which vendors the agency solicited and their responses. Signed, fax, or electronic bids are acceptable. Screen prints from internet sites are not acceptable as a valid bid. A vendor choosing to submit a bid or a written change to a bid by electronic transmission accepts full responsibility for transmission and receipt of the bid or written change to the bid. The state accepts no responsibility for the unsuccessful and/or incomplete transmission of bids by electronic transmission. Keep in mind that a no bid does not count as a bid. If 3 bids cannot be obtained, the agency must document its attempt to get 3 bids and place that documentation in the agency file. When an agency's purchase is expected to exceed $25,000, the agency would then go through the Purchasing Division for the formal acquisition process. The Purchasing Division is responsible for acquiring all commodities and services on behalf of the state. Likewise, agencies under the executive branch of state government are required to process purchases estimated to exceed $25,000 through the Purchasing Division, unless statutorily exempt. Since the Purchasing Division has delegated purchasing authority to state agencies for procurements estimated to cost $25,000 or less, it is important that agency purchasers understand all stipulations relating to these purchases. When possible, the spending unit is encouraged to use the state purchasing card. The use of the state purchasing card is simply a method of payment. Amounts spent with vendors are viewed comprehensively. State agencies should continuously monitor their expenditures with vendors to ensure that the total amount spent with a given vendor in a year's time does not exceed a bid threshold without the proper level of documentation and bidding. No agency shall issue a series of requisitions or purchase orders to circumvent the $25,000 threshold. This action, referred to as stringing, is prohibited by law. The purchasing director has the authority to suspend or reduce purchasing authority for any spending unit that fails to report multiple contract awards that are deemed by the director to circumvent the $25,000 threshold within a 12-month period. In the event of suspension or reduction of purchasing authority, the the Director shall prescribe revised procedures and limits which may require all spending unit purchases, regardless of amount, be made by the Purchasing Division. Since purchases $25,000 and under are processed at the agency level, it is a responsibility of the agency to retain in the agency file copies of requisitions, purchase orders, and other documentation. And finally, agency personnel are always encouraged to use West Virginia vendors for agency-delegated purchases to help strengthen the overall state's economy. No matter what the expected purchase amount is for a commodity or service of interest to an agency, that agency should follow 4 steps before they continue with an agency-delegated purchase. First, the agency must determine its need. Next, the agency should check availability of that need through internal resources and statewide or agency contracts. If it is not available through either of those means, the agency must determine if the purchase will be a sole source purchase or an emergency purchase. Once the agency follows each of these steps, it will then be permitted to proceed with the agency-delegated purchase following purchasing procedures for procurements of $25,000 or less. We'll talk more about each of these steps in the coming slides. The first step that we just mentioned is determination of need. The agency must determine the commodity or service that is required, including the quality level, delivery requirements, and estimated cost. The agency may also want to consider if this need requires a one-time purchase or multiple purchases over a period of time. Remember that the agency needs to avoid issuing a series of purchase orders of the same commodity or service in a year's time so as to avoid stringing. If those multiple purchases would exceed a bid threshold, the agency may want to consider an open-end contract. And finally, the agency may want to consider if there are any alternatives or options that can meet their needs. Once a need is established, the agency must determine if the commodity or service is available from an internal resource, including correctional industries, the state use law, also known as sheltered workshops, and the West Virginia State Agency for Surplus Property. If it is available through one of the internal resources, the commodity or service must be acquired through that manner. However, if the commodity or service is available, but not in the required time, quality, quantity, or other factors, a written waiver must be obtained from the internal resource in accordance with purchasing guidelines. If the commodity or service is not available from any of the internal resources, the agency must determine if that commodity or service is available from a statewide or agency contract. If it is available, the agency must purchase the commodity or service in accordance with purchasing guidelines as indicated within the statewide or agency contract. If the commodity or service is not available through an existing statewide or agency contract, the agency must determine if the purchase should be competitively bid, is offered by a sole source vendor, or is a result of an emergency. Making this determination could ultimately affect the purchasing procedures that the agency must follow. If the competitive commodity or service is not available through an internal resource or through a statewide or agency contract, and if it is expected to cost $25,000 or less, the agency must then follow its agency-delegated purchasing procedures. All contracts should be entered into for a firm, fixed price per unit of goods or service. In such cases where the nature of the procurement prohibits a firm fixed price, a detailed written justification must be included in the file. A public record of all purchasing transactions must be kept on file at the agency location and is subject to inspection at the discretion of the Purchasing Division. This file must also include a certificate of non-conflict of interest, supporting documentation for verification searches as applicable, specifications used for the bidding process, any and all attempts to obtain competitive bids, and a team screen print of the VOS screen indicating that the vendor is properly registered and not on hold. Agencies which use Team for delegated purchasing are exempt from the requirement to retain a team screen print. Delegated authority is not required. It is a privilege and may be revoked at any time. When preparing to make an agency-delegated purchase, the agency should consider the acquisition and delivery lead time. This includes the administrative lead time, expiring funds, and delivery time. The administrative lead time is the amount of time required to prepare, solicit, evaluate, and make an award. This time may depend upon the responsiveness of the vendor community and the complexity of the requisition. The agency should also consider the expiration of funds when planning administrative lead time. All agreements, many change orders, and other documents require an effective date at which time the vendor may begin to supply the commodities or services as specified. The third consideration is delivery lead time, which is the time after the award is made that is required by suppliers to fill an order and deliver by designated means, such as truck, rail, or air, to the delivery point. These times vary widely by industry or commodity. Consideration must be given to market conditions which will affect the delivery. Custom-made and complex items of equipment normally take longer to obtain than in-stock items. Once you've considered the acquisition and delivery lead time, you should develop written specifications for any purchases between $5,000 and $25,000. A specification is a concise statement explaining the type of commodity or service, the quality level, and any special requirements in design, performance, delivery, and usage. They should be written in a way that ensures vendors are being provided a fair opportunity to quote comparable products. They must not be too restrictive, locking in a specific vendor and limiting competition, or be too vague, allowing a vendor to provide a lower than acceptable quality level commodity or service. There are 3 specification types: brand name or equal, performance, and design. The brand name or equal specification is based upon one or more manufacturer's commodity description, model number, and quality level. The general name of the item should be listed first. The manufacturer and model number of the item should immediately follow. The words "or equal" are inserted to inform vendors that alternate bids will be considered. The manufacturer's commodity number must be easily identified in a current publication that is available to most vendors, and commodity descriptions must be sufficiently detailed and specify only the required features needed for the application. Unless a feature or requirement is specifically listed on the solicitation, it will not be used to disqualify a vendor. The performance specification is based upon the specific performance needs of the purchaser. The performance specification is less structured as to how the product is made and more structured as to how well it operates. Total ownership cost for operating and maintaining the product should be included in the specifications. And lastly, the design specification concentrates on the dimensional and other physical requirements of an item being purchased. The design specification is used when the commodity has to be specially made to meet the purchaser's unique needs. What is a good specification? Good specifications are clearly understandable to both the buyer and the seller. They are complete and include every mandatory requirement that the agency requires a commodity or service to meet. They are concise, leaving out all unnecessary details, and whenever possible, they should be identifiable with some brand or specification already on the market. Good specifications are also verifiable, meaning they are written in such a way that the purchasing division can confirm that the bid submissions meet the specifications. And finally, good specifications are reasonable. Following each of these components when writing specifications can save the agency time and money when preparing to solicit bids. Over the next few slides, I'll discuss the forms that are recommended and/or required when making an agency-delegated purchase. The first form listed on the screen in front of you is the Verbal Bid Quotation Summary Form, known as a Wv4 Daa. This is a recommended form for documenting verbal bids on small purchases of $2,500.01 up to $5,000. This is not a required form, but the information that it contains is required information for the agency file. When using this form, the agency should note which vendors were contacted, provide a description of the commodity or service the agency is requesting, and document the unit price and total amount quoted by each vendor. It is also important to include on this form any delivery requirements, shipping dates, and terms the agency may have. And finally, to complete the form, the agency should include a justification as to why one vendor was chosen over the others, complete with the signature and title of the person who authorized the purchase. The next form listed is a Request for Quotations form, known as the Wv43. The RFQ form should be used to acquire all tangible property, such as equipment and supplies. The RFQ is required for all purchases between $5,000.01 and $25,000. Exceptions to this requirement may be granted by the purchasing director. An RFQ consists of 5 things. 1. A detailed description of, or specification for, the item or items being purchased. 2. A delivery date if required. 3. A bid price per unit of the item or items. 4. Any applicable maintenance. And 5. Quantities of all items. Each item should be identified by a model number or some other specific identification. Prices cannot be altered after bids are opened. The RFQ should have a date and time for the bid opening, after which bids will no longer be accepted. All bids should be stamped with the date and time of receipt. The Wv4 Daa is a standard agreement form for agencies and vendors and is used primarily for services. This form must include a detailed description of the service to be performed, the dates that the service is expected, and the vendor's rate of pay. Any anticipated travel must be incorporated into the vendor's fee. No travel will be reimbursed by the state and is the sole responsibility of the vendor. Signatures from both the agency and vendor are required, and the form must be retained in the agency file. The Wv4 Daa is similar in that it is a standard agreement form used by agencies and vendors. However, this particular form is used for transactions of non-competitive or exempt commodities and services which do not require Purchasing Division approval, but do require Attorney General approval as to form. In addition to the agency and vendor signatures, the Assistant Attorney General is also required to sign this form. Once a contract is awarded, then the agency purchase order, which is sometimes the WV88, is generated. All agencies making purchases of $2,500.01 up to $25,000 use this form. This document acts as the agency's contract with the vendor. Therefore, all information quoted to you by the successful vendor, including the item number, quantity, description of the commodity or service, the unit price, and the total amount, should be documented on this form. The agency is required to sign this form. The WV88A is similar to the agency purchase order, but is used for non-competitive and exempt commodities that do not require Purchasing Division approval, but do require Attorney General approval as to form. In addition to the agency's signature, the Assistant Attorney General also needs to sign this form. The next form that is required when applicable is the Agreement Addendum, known as the WV96. This form is a universal agreement addendum which must be signed and retained as part of the final contract or agreement any time a vendor proposes alternate terms and conditions to those of the Purchasing Division. The WV96 must be signed by the same person who signed the quote and dated concurrent with or subsequent to the date of the quote. It is important to note that the vendor must sign the agreement addendum first and then return it to the agency for its signature. The two final forms are the Purchasing Affidavit and the Vendor Preference Certificate. The Purchasing Affidavit is used to certify that bidders do not owe any debts to the state which would preclude them from receiving a purchase order, and must be notarized to be considered valid. The Vendor Preference Certificate is used for certification and application of bidders which are eligible to receive vendor preference. It provides an opportunity for qualifying resident vendors to request, at the time of their bid, preference for their residency status, or for a non-resident vendor which employs a minimum of 100 state residents to request preference. This preference is an evaluation method only and will be applied only to the cost bid in accordance with the West Virginia Code. Please note that this preference does not apply to construction contracts. To ensure that agencies are properly processing and documenting purchasing transactions at the agency level, inspectors within the Contract Management Unit of the Purchasing Division conduct regular audits. At any and all times, the inspector shall have access to agency personnel, records, reports, and other documents as needed. Each inspector is assigned to an agency. The agency will receive a letter stating the name of its designated inspector and the date of the scheduled inspection. The inspector will conduct the audit and then review the results with the respective agency. The agency is allotted 2 weeks to dispute or accept the results. At the end of the 2 weeks, the results and any modifications to the results become official and are kept in a file both at the Purchasing Division and at the agency. At that point, the information is considered a matter of public record. To further ensure quality assurance, the inspectors also provide relevant training for agency personnel on rules and regulations related to agency-delegated purchasing. Now that we've discussed the different spending limits within the agency's delegated authority, the steps required prior to making an agency-delegated purchase, and the forms that the agency will use when applicable to make that purchase, it is important to understand the role of the agency procurement officer. According to the Code of State Rules, each state agency has one or more procurement officers who are responsible and knowledgeable in the state purchasing guidelines as well as their own agency procedures. It is important to note that questions from agency personnel relating to purchasing issues should be directed first to the respected agency procurement officer rather than directly to the purchasing division. If the agency procurement officer needs assistance, they are encouraged to contact the appropriate state buyer in the Acquisition and Contract Administration section of the Purchasing Division for assistance. In addition to knowing the policies and procedures related to purchasing for the state and their individual agencies, the agency procurement officer ensures compliance with bidding levels, defines a need for his or her agency, performs acquisition planning, researches a market, and creates specifications for the commodity or service needed by the agency. For a complete list of agency procurement officers, visit the link on the screen in front of you. For additional information on agency-delegated purchasing procedures, check out the West Virginia Code, the Code of State Rules, and the Purchasing Division's Procedures Handbook. The sections are listed on the screen in front of you. If upon further review, you still have questions related to agency-delegated purchasing, have your assigned agency procurement officer contact your agency's designated purchasing division buyer. Should you have any questions about the information covered in this presentation, contact your designated purchasing buyer or Staff Development Specialist Samantha Knapp at 304-558-7022. Print the certificate of completion and have it signed by your immediate supervisor or manager. Then email a copy of it to samantha.s.knapp@wv.gov or fax it to Samantha's attention at 304-558-6026. Thank you for taking the time to view this agency-delegated purchasing online module.